All right. Well, I'm certainly appreciate you all coming to listen to what I have to say. I was telling George that this has been my most requested presentation over the years. You can see that I started doing it back in 2013, and I must have half a dozen or more variations of this because time's a consideration. I'm leaving some things out, but I don't think it makes a big difference. I think this is probably the most important presentation I do. I enjoy sharing my passion for birds and wildlife with everyone. I've been at it a long, long time. But even a few years ago, I learned a few things that changed, sort of my outlook on things. So I'm going to be talking about what I've seen and what I think will help you attract some more birds and butterflies to your yards. Yes, I have seen 100 species of birds in my yard. Some of them are flying overhead. Some of them nest in my yard. We have four kinds of birds, or four groups of birds broadly, that we need to think about. We have the resident birds that are with us year round. Geese would be one. I don't know how many of you want those in your yard, but birds like woodpeckers, a couple kinds of woodpeckers, chickadees, even robins are year round here in the Chicago area. We have birds that migrate through in the spring and the fall. I've seen sandhill cranes literally by the thousands standing in my driveway. There are probably a half a dozen or more birds I've only seen once in my life, and that's been from my yard as they were migrating through. They're very uncommon birds. One or two might even be considered rare. We have winter birds that come to our feeders, and you'll be seeing pictures of some of those. And then, of course, we have summer birds. George was just talking about hummingbirds. I put my feeder out about a week ago, and about 3 days after that, I had hummingbirds show up in numbers. But I'm going to start with what I think is maybe kind of a slap in the face or a real shock to a lot of people. I know it was to me when I first read about this or heard about this. Since year 1970, North America has lost 3 billion birds, or roughly 1 out of every 4. And that was a study published in Science, which is a peer-reviewed journal. A lot of groups have gotten on this and have been very concerned about this. But 1 out of every 4 birds in North America has disappeared in 50 years. Now, part of it is made clear by this map. On the left, you have Illinois in the early 1800s, and I'm sure you could find similar maps for any state or any area you want. But on the right, we have present day Illinois, and you can see the land use has changed a lot, and things within the landscape have changed. And I'm going to be talking about some of those things that really concern me, especially when I found out that people I know who have just as interested in wildlife and just as concerned with conservation did not know about or did not realize. But this is one of the reasons. Birds that were once uncommon within some people's lifetime are now common or abundant. The cardinal on the left, that was a southern bird, southeastern United States. And because not only the climate's warming, but because people feed the birds and things are changing, this bird is found further and further north. And in fact, most of you, if you pay attention to birds, cardinals are with us year round. On the other hand, there's robins. 100 years ago, robins were fairly uncommon in our area, but the land use changed. What happened? Well, if you mow your lawn, if you've ever played golf, if you go to any of the parks around here, we've created what in nature would be considered an edge habitat, which cardinals really like. The other thing that happened, and this was something I didn't know, earthworms were introduced from Europe, and cardinals quickly became vermivores. They feed heavily on earthworms. So what we've created in our suburbs, even in our more urban areas, is ideal robin habitat. Well, we're going to be talking about what you can do and how to make your property more attractive. But here's something the Laboratory of Ornithology at Cornell University published in 2016. It noted that there's 3 million acres of public land in the United States, roughly 13% of all land. But despite all those protections and successes, studies show that the loss of habitat and biodiversity is accelerating. So even though we're doing all this, it's really turning out not to be quite enough. And coincidentally, roughly 13% of DuPage County is now forest preserve land. So that, I thought that was an interesting correlation. Many landscapes that look, very attractive to us are hostile to wildlife. I could have shown you a picture of any one of a number of parks here in Glen Ellyn and probably in Woodridge in any suburb that are really big grassy expanses. They're there for football games and baseball games and soccer games, whatever. This is a section of the Illinois Prairie Path, which in one of the suburbs. And the day I visited this site, I didn't see a single bird. And that little patch of grass and flowers over there in the lower left-hand corner, that was a butterfly garden. Well, I didn't see a single butterfly. In fact, I don't recall seeing any insect of any size, a honeybee, a bumblebee, dragonfly, or anything like that. Part of the reason for this is that most of the plants you see here are non-native. And I'm going to be returning to that idea over and over again this evening. It's very important to keep in mind that non-native plants really are not good if you want to nurture wildlife in your garden. Here's an example, the Callery pear. Many suburbs still make this available to plant in boulevards. Part of its original attraction, it's pretty in the spring, look at the flowers, was that supposedly it was sterile. Well, that turned out to be a big, big mistake. Not only is it not sterile, but it's very, very prolific. In fact, there's a section along the DuPage River here in Glen Ellyn that the whole area is covered with Callery pear. I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but College of DuPage, where I taught for a number of years, was originally designed to be eco-friendly. And for a period of time, we had a rather infamous president who ripped out all the native plantings and replaced it with things like Callery pear. And now people in charge of the natural areas at the college are trying very hard every year to remove as much Callery pear as they can find, but it keeps popping up in unexpected places. My mentor with all of this is Douglas Tolomei, and I'm sure George has books by Tolomei in his library, or you can get them on interlibrary loan. Tolomei, Doug taught at the University of Delaware, and my brother taught there for a while, so I kind of sort of know Doug. But he wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home, and he says this in the book: for the first time in its history, gardening has taken on a role that transcends the needs of the gardener. Like it or not, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. It is now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference. In this case, the difference will be the future of biodiversity to the native plants and animals of North America and the ecosystems that sustain them. And I'm going to just state this as close to a fact as it can be. Biodiversity is important because ecologists have concluded that biodiversity leads to stability. An author, Kurt Vonnegut, wrote in one of his essays that in nature, if one side wins, all sides lose. In nature, it's important to have a balance, and balance is achieved through biodiversity. So what we're going to be talking tonight, backyard habitats are vital. Here we have a male American goldfinch. They're year-round birds in my yard. They don't nest in my yard, but they come for the bird bath, and in the winter they come for the seeds. But I know my backyard is a place that I've had, 20 or 30 of these birds in it at one time. So let's talk about an approach most people are familiar with, and it's one of the easiest approaches to take. If you want to attract birds and butterflies, just provide their basic needs: food, water, and shelter. Here we have a dark-eyed junco. It's one of those winter visitors that we get. When you're shivering in Chicago because it's 0 degrees and the wind's blowing, to the dark-eyed junco, that may as well be the beaches of Mexico or Florida or Caribbean. Now, I have friends who disagree with me on this. They don't believe in feeding birds. I disagree. I see bird feeders and feeding birds as a way to supplement, complement, or in very rare cases, replace natural food sources if those food sources aren't available. In this picture, I have 3 feeders that I've used over the years. From left to right, there's a variety of what I call a hopper feeder. It's basically a box that you put seed in and it comes out and the birds eat it. In the middle, that yellow bag is a thistle feeder, and I'll have more to say about that. And on the right is a tube feeder. The birds you see at these feeders are pine siskins. They're relatives of the American goldfinch, and they tend to visit us late fall through early spring. You can attract a lot of birds by putting out bird food. And incidentally, if you don't want a feeder, you can simply throw it on the ground. That works well too. But Cornell University's Laboratory of Ornithology every winter has a project it calls Feeder Watch. You do have to pay a little to participate. But these are some of the birds you can see at your feeder. And I have seen everything here with the exception, let me see, I don't think I've had purple finches in my yard, and I haven't had evening grosbeaks. But everything else on this page, I've seen in my yard, some every year, some infrequently. And of course, here's another group of birds. And again, these are birds that you probably would get in your yard if you started feeding them. The only ones I have not seen in my yard are the Carolina chickadee and the Carolina wren. As their name suggests, they're from the southeast, although I have seen Carolina wrens at Hidden Lake Forest Preserve. I have mourning doves, robins, and cardinals nesting on my property right now. So let's start with the thistle sock feeder. It's designed specifically for finches, goldfinches, siskins, and similar birds, small birds. It's filled with Niger seed, or sometimes it's called thistle, but it's not. Niger is a South African plant, and there's several different spellings. And I discovered today, or realized that I use all the spellings. But nice thing about Niger seed is that it doesn't sprout if the birds miss it and it gets in your grass. Another thing, it does not attract squirrels. It's pretty much a finch only seed. And you can go to maybe garden centers. There's a wild bird food store on Ogden Avenue in Lisle, and you can go there and buy a thistle feeder like this, and you can put Niger seed in it, and pretty much in a week or two you're going to get some visitors. Another kind of feeder is called a hopper feeder, and I have the ones here had the advantage, they were called squirrel proof, and maybe I should say something about that before too long. And you put the seed in the top. It's designed in theory so that if a squirrel or a large heavy bird perches on it, it shuts and they can't have access to the seed. On the left, I have a white-breasted nuthatch, and on the right, of course, is a cardinal. I got to tell you, though, that I did have a problem a couple years ago during the winter. Raccoons started messing with my feeders. And one winter, actually, I had a squirrel get into one during a cold snap and lock itself in. And I discovered it a week later and it was frozen solid. So accidents happen, but I probably should have been paying more close attention to my feeder, but it was a cold week. And I suddenly realized I wasn't seeing too many birds. The dead squirrel had a lot to do with it. Got rid of the squirrel, put in some more seed, and the birds came back. What you feed the birds is important. And you can buy mixes of seed and you can buy pure seeds. Probably the best general seed is black oil sunflower seeds. My personal preference is for the kind that's been hulled. It doesn't have the shell on it. It's not as messy. I have come to the conclusion that chickadees would prefer to open up the seed, so they don't always take the kind I provide, but they will. They just do prefer the shell on them. Safflower seed is something that cardinals like and a few other birds. Squirrels do not like safflower seeds, so that's one advantage of that one. Millet is a small white seed. Most birds will eat it, especially the sparrows and finches. Niger, we've already talked about. That's another spelling. Crack corn is very good for several kinds of birds. Doves, for example, I haven't seen too many reports of them. They used to be very common in the county, but there used to be pheasants. Squirrels will come for crack corn. You throw that, I'd simply throw on the ground if I were feeding it. In fact, if you don't want to put up a feeder, you can just throw seed on the ground and a lot of birds will come to it. Peanuts are very good for a number of birds. Blue jays especially like peanuts. The disadvantage to me of peanuts is it's very attractive to squirrels. Milo is found in a lot of less expensive blends. So if you look at the content, you see Milo and you have a choice, I would try to avoid that. House sparrows like it, starlings like it. Most of our native birds ignore it. And you can recognize it. It's a little bit larger than millet, which is a small pale yellow. Milo is kind of an orange color. It's a little bit larger. I've been talking about squirrels. Some people aren't bothered by squirrels. Some people really are. You can buy things that are called squirrel-proof feeders. You can do all sorts of things to discourage squirrels. In my experience, sooner or later, a squirrel will figure out a way to get into the seed. I already told you about the one who actually got in the feeder that you see in this picture. I had a feeder that I used this winter, a tube feeder that was in a cage, and it was pretty good at keeping the squirrels out, but there was one runt of a squirrel that managed to squeeze itself in and used to raid my feeder that way. But you can buy all sorts of things, and it's not that they don't work, but I don't find they are absolutely foolproof. A lot of insect-eating birds will like suet, and you can buy it in cakes. I have found that most of the cakes are like the ones you see here. They come with grain in it, and unfortunately, that too is attractive to squirrels. If you look at the photograph on the right, you'll see that the top of the suet block has been gnawed at. But birds, and I should say that squirrels got rid of these blocks, and they're not inexpensive, would go through one in a day, day and a half. But I have a downy woodpecker there on the left and a red-breasted nuthatch on the right. And you can make, if you don't want to go and buy suet blocks, something I've done from time to time in the past is take bacon grease, melt it, mix it with rolled oats, let it harden again, and put that out. And I guess I could use seed. I always used rolled oats, and the birds like that too. Don't be surprised if your bird feeder attracts birds that feed on birds. This is a Cooper's hawk that was in my yard last September, and it showed up one day and hung around in the afternoon. And not surprisingly, there were a few birds. Every once in a while, I find evidence that the Cooper's hawk has gotten one of the birds, but they're bird eaters. That's what they do, and they're considered a very uncommon hawk. I've actually probably seen more around bird feeders in these western suburbs than I've seen when I've gone into the forest preserves. My own yard especially, but I've seen them. I remember watching one that caught a robin or something along St. Charles Road in Elmhurst in a church lot. Water is important, and don't overlook it. Now that the days are getting warmer, water will attract a lot of birds. Here we have a robin bathing and a house sparrow drinking. I've been telling people for years the house sparrows only drink, they don't bathe. But last summer, I spent a lot of time watching my bird bath, and I discovered the house sparrows from time to time will take a dip. I always know when the robins have been there because the water is dirty. And I always have to change it. And it's a good idea in the summer months to change it every day anyway. Now, this particular bird bath I bought, and I haven't seen it offered anyplace since then. I bought this many years ago, and it's basically a large plastic tray that sits in a metal frame. I've made something similar. I've taken the largest plant saucer I could find, and I've taken a tomato cage. I've cut the legs off the bottom of the tomato cage and turned it upside down and placed the saucer on top, filled it with water, and birds will visit that too. And of course, you can buy concrete ones. Most people do that. Plastic, the birds don't seem to care. This particular bird bath gets a lot more traffic than my other ones, and I think it's probably due to placement rather than design. I have it next to some bushes in my garden, and the birds feel very secure coming there. Mourning doves have come there. You've seen this American goldfinch visit the bird bath. But you don't really need to do that either. If you sprinkle your lawn, if you water your lawn, sometimes that attracts birds. I remember being over at my parents' house many years ago during the spring migration, and they had the sprinkler on, and there were a half dozen kinds of warblers flying in and out of the sprinkler. Today, I was watering a section of my lawn using kind of a nozzle attachment, and I happened to look out the window and I saw a pair of cardinals splashing around in the water. So again, you don't need to go all this way, but providing water is important. Finally, animals need shelter. Now, a lot of birds nest in trees. They nest, where the branches are. Baltimore Orioles are famous for building their hanging nest, but a lot of birds are hole nesters, like this hairy woodpecker. And they like to use dead trees and the branches of dead trees. Well, in residential areas, such things are kind of problematic. And that results in a lot of competition. For example, I showed you the hairy woodpecker. Here's the female. And about a week after I took the female's picture at the nest hole, I went back to check, and I found that house wrens had displaced the hairy woodpecker. People like house wrens because they're small and they have a bubbly song, but they're vicious little guys. They'll go into nest holes and tear apart the nest. If they find eggs of another bird, they'll throw them out. They've even been reported to throw out hatchlings. So what do? Well, we need to provide nest boxes, and they'll be used by many species. Here's a bluebird box that was used by tree swallows in one of the forest preserves. The forest preserve personnel have discovered that tree swallows honestly, will be the first birds to use a nest box. So what they've learned to do is to put two nest boxes close to each other And the tree swallows will move into one. And if tree swallows try to move into the other one, well, the pair that was there first will drive them away. And so the bluebirds, like these two eastern bluebirds, were able to nest. What you'll find, though, people have a lot of questions, and this, I'm sure there are books in the library that can help you, and I know there's resources online. I'm going to make some generalizations. Most birds prefer a simple size-specific nest box. I've seen nest boxes that look like they should be on HGTV. And quite frankly, most birds don't find that very appealing. A box like this, and this is a bluebird box, and you'll notice that it has that extra piece of wood. That's a feature designed to keep out starlings and house sparrows. Most birds have preferences, and if you go online, you'll find all kinds of sources that will give you the dimensions of the box. So things like how big it is inside, how deep it is, how high up the hole is, how big the hole is, all can make a difference. How high you place it off the ground. Generally, you want for in our area, you like the boxes to face south because that gives them the most exposure to the sun, keeps them out of most of the storms that come through in the summer. Those are all very good things. A few years ago, I made about a half a dozen nest boxes. We were redoing our kitchen and they were tearing out a lot of wood. And I used the scrap wood, and I didn't put them up on my property. I put them up at a nature preserve that was at the time very much neglected. And every single one of those boxes was used within the year. So you put up the nest boxes, you'll get results. If you want a good one size meets all, generally, if you follow the directions for a bluebird box, that's a good idea. I would recommend very strongly, though, you do not put a perch for the box because house sparrows prefer to have a perch, and other birds, our North American birds, prefer not to have a perch. So that's something you need to keep in mind. Well, we were talking about three things: food, water, shelter, that you can do. But another approach is to think in terms of creating a backyard habitat. And this is the gardening part. And here's a very key idea, again, from Ptolemy. And this was news to a lot of people who thought they knew a thing or two about nature. Ptolemy writes in Bringing Nature Home, all plants are not created equal, particularly in their ability to support wildlife. Most of our native plant eaters are not able to eat alien plants, and we are replacing native plants with alien species at an alarming rate, especially in the suburban gardens on which our wildlife depends. Unless we restore native plants to our suburban ecosystems, the future of biodiversity in the United States is dim. I know that's a very grim statement. And I'm going to, what I'm going to say in the next few minutes is going to expand on that. Things to keep in mind when you design and plant for wildlife. First of all, trees. I'm embarrassed to say this. I have 3 very big hardwood trees on my property. 2 I did not plant. They were here when I bought the place. 1 the village put in the boulevard. They're Norway maples. I've lived in this house going on 40 years, which means I've raked up a lot of leaves. I've looked at a lot of leaves. I have not seen one leaf that has any evidence at all that a moth or a butterfly caterpillar ate it. Nor do I have evidence that the birds and the small mammals eat the seeds of Norway maples. They want our native maples. So, sugar maples, silver maples, swamp maples, those are all good choices. The leaves of these trees are the host plants to almost 300 butterfly and moth species. If you like butterflies, you're going to want to have some native trees around your property. Other trees I see being planted in boulevards, the Callery pear is one. The ginkgo tree is almost extinct, I understand, in China. Well, we plant it in this country, it does well. One of the reasons it does well is because none of our native insects will eat it. It's essentially pest-free. If someone wants to correct me on this in the future, I welcome it. But actually, when I hear something described as pest-free, to me that means it's non-edible. It's like the plastic apple you have in the bowl on the dining room table. Birch trees are a good native tree to plant. So are spruce trees and pine trees, poplar trees. There are cherry plum and native chokeberry cherry trees that you can plant. Oak trees, especially the white oak tree, are very good. The acorns, of course, for squirrels and jays and a number of other birds. But in the spring, you see that I say 500 butterflies and moths lay their eggs on white oak trees. That's why some of the oak forest around here, the forest down at Green Valley, the oak forest there, the forest up in Downers Grove, what is it called? Maple Grove, out in Winfield, Elson's Hill. They have big stands of oak trees, and those oak trees have caterpillars on them, and those caterpillars feed the warblers and other songbirds as they fly north. And during the summer, even seed-eating birds like cardinals and the towhees feed their young insects. And I don't know if you know this, but most seed-eating birds eat insects until they're adults. And then, of course, willow trees. So these are all good trees for birds. Shrubs are another good thing to have. If you remember that photograph I showed you of what I called the green desert along the prairie path, you'd notice that there weren't any shrubs. Shrubs provide nest sites. They're host plants for insects, but their berries provide food for birds, especially in the fall. So serviceberry, redbud, arrowwood viburnum, blueberry, sassafras, sumac, spicewood, highbush cranberry. Those are all types of shrubs that we can plant in our yards that do a lot of good in terms of helping birds. They're native birds. An interesting thing I read a few years ago was that a lot of the non-native berry shrubs and vines, and I think honeysuckle was given as an example, turns out birds like them because they have a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of sugar, but they're very low in the amino acids. I guess that's the proteins. And so literally, when a bird comes to a honeysuckle and eats its berries, it's like a kid in the candy store. You want your kid to eat the broccoli and the fish and maybe the mashed potatoes or whatever, and the kid's eating all the candy. Same thing applies to birds. And here's a photograph I took just a few days ago of a robin eating the berries off a sumac that had been chopped down from an area where sumac were taking over a grassy field. But even in this dried state in the spring, robins were depending on the sumac berries as a food source. And that's the reason why robins stay in our area during the winter. As long as there's berries and some open water, robins will stay in this area. Now, there's some other aspects that are less pleasant about the berries we plant. Here's a shrub I just learned about that birds like the cedar waxwing apparently are drawn to. They're very hardy, they're very invasive, and they're very toxic to birds. In fact, if a cedar waxwing eats enough of the berries, and they usually do, within a short period of time, the toxin in the berries kills the bird. Some states have outlawed nurseries from selling this particular shrub, but I understand that it's available online. Another shrub that actually accounts for about 1/3 of all the woody plant growth in our forest preserves is buckthorn. And it like I said, 1/3 of all the trees and shrubs in forest preserves are buckthorn, and stewards and the district staff tried very hard, diligently, to get rid of this. I just learned today of a forest preserve in Wheaton, Bellow Woods, that 50 years ago was preserved because there were so many rare wildflowers there, and the district had to go through this past winter and cut out buckthorn. They hadn't realized to what extent buckthorn had taken over the preserve. It was introduced in our country in the 1850s, surprisingly by one of the first naturalists in the Chicago area, a guy named Kennicott. Very popular in Europe. In our area, though, it overpowers the wildflowers. It leaves out earlier in the spring, so it prevents the wildflowers from getting the sunlight they need, and it keeps its leaves on longer. It produces a toxin that discourages other plants from growing underneath it. So not only does it keep the flowers from blooming because they don't get any light, but it's actually poisoning the soil. And in areas where those toxins get into the water, it kills fish, amphibians, and their eggs. Birds like their berries, and they eat them. And what happens if the berries don't actually kill the birds? They cause the birds to vomit and have diarrhea. And by that time, enough of the berry has been digested that the seed is expelled. And so that's one way they spread. I have a little bit in my garden that I keep every year, pruning and doing what I can to get rid of it. I have a neighbor who thinks it's the greatest thing. And unless I sneak over there in the middle of the night and cut his down, I guess I'm going to have to deal with buckthorn as long as I live in this house. But I do have red buds. I tried for years to get them to grow, and they wouldn't grow. And then they started volunteering. So I have 2 really nice sized redbud trees, and I get a lot of birds on them. And of course, they're very pretty in the spring. Seed producing flowers are another thing you can do, and they do a double duty. Most of them will also be attractive to butterflies. Yarrow, black-eyed Susan, purple coneflower, asters, and goldenrod are some of the flowers I have every year in my yard. They're perennials. A couple years ago, I tried to harvest purple coneflower seeds so I could plant them over the winter and have plants to put in the garden in the spring. And I found that just about every one of the flowers had been completely stripped of its seeds by goldfinches. I also plant zinnias and marigolds. From time to time, I plant bachelor buttons, sunflowers, and daisies, and they all produce seeds that attract the birds in late summer and fall. The sunflowers are very popular with the squirrels, of course. I've never done this, but maybe I know people who do. You can also plant native grasses that produce seeds. And these are some of the species that have worked well. Switchgrass, blue fescue, little blue stem, wild rye, Indian grass, tufted hair grass. And birds like the seeds of those. I will say that the one thing I like about house sparrows is they do eat crabgrass seeds. So, they're not, house sparrows have their place too. Natural plantings are the way to go if you want to attract hummingbirds. And the rule of thumb is red tubular flowers. I have had extraordinary success with a type of bee balm called Cambridge Scarlet. It's red. I see wild bee balm or Monarda in the forest preserves. It's kind of a pale violet blue, and I've seen hummingbirds at that. We'll get to butterflies in a minute or two, but they prefer flowers that kind of have a flat or tabletop. These are flowers that you might want to try. I have some of these, excuse me. These are suggestions I've gotten out of the book. Cardinal flower, the one I picture here, attracts hummingbirds. Columbine, I have Columbine. The wild variety works better than the domestic cultivars. but I've had hummingbirds come to my columbine. Bee balm I've already talked about. Impatiens, I was a little astonished to see that, but then I have seen hummingbirds come to impatiens that I've planted in hanging bird planters. Wigelia, which, yes, it's non-native, but butterflies do come to its flowers, and it's not invasive, so it doesn't present as much a threat as some other species. Lantana works well. Marigolds work well in the fall. New England asters, nasturtiums, chives. I haven't had much success with that. Coreopsis, I had a lot of success with that. Purple coneflower works well. White clover, I'm a little skeptical about that. It's in all the books, but I have a lot of it in my grass, and I've never seen a hummingbird on it. And daylilies, and again, I'm a little skeptical. I have a lot of daylilies, and I've never seen a hummingbird at a daylily. Commercial feeders work very well, and you don't have to spend a lot of money for the syrup. If you take 1 part white sugar to 4 parts of water, and you dissolve it, let it cool, that works really well. You don't want to put colors or dye in the syrup. There's some concerns that those dyes may cause cancer in the birds. Some of the dyes, of course, have been shown to cause cancer in rats and mice. This particular feeder is the most effective one I have, incidentally, and I bought it at the dollar store for $1. And unfortunately, I've gone to every dollar store within 20 minutes of my house over the last couple of weeks, and I don't think they're carrying them this year. But it's very simple and very effective. My son bought me a very fancy blown glass feeder that I never saw a hummingbird at. I got a lot of bees in it, and I found wasps would fly into it and kind of get trapped and drown. But this works very well. So what about butterflies and moths? Well, let's start with the easiest way to attract butterflies. The best flower species tend to be very easily grown species. And in fact, many things that we consider weeds, for example, dandelions, are excellent for attracting butterflies. Here you have a tiger swallowtail on top of a zinnia in my garden. There is something out there called butterfly bush, budelia. Butterfly gardeners are torn about that. In some parts of the country, it's very, very invasive and gets out of control. It has the disadvantage that although it's shrubby, none of the caterpillars of our native butterflies will eat its leaves, but they all like its nectar. And messy gardens often provide the best habitat. Here you have a giant swallowtail on a thistle plant. For those of you who like your roses and trying to think what they're called now, begonias and peonies, bad news is butterflies don't tend to like those. They like flowers with nectar. Some butterflies tend to have very specific taste in terms of nectar, but I monitor butterflies for the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, and of the 25 or so most common butterflies in our region, none is very much of an epicure when it comes to what flowers it will nectar on. Just, what's ever available and abundant they like. Some people think yellow flowers work better. I don't have evidence of that. But here's something you need to keep in mind. Butterflies come from caterpillars, and a lot of people consider caterpillars pests. One of my favorite butterflies is the black swallowtail, and its larvae, its caterpillars, feed on things in the parsley family. Queen Anne's lace, carrots, parsley, those sorts of things. Fennel, dill. In fact, I grow those plants specifically get the caterpillars and I raise them. I release, I go through the life cycle and release them. But that's a really important reason not to use insecticides indiscriminately, because if it kills a mosquito, chances are it's going to kill the caterpillars. Now, most species are very particular about their host plants. A lot of people are familiar with the monarch caterpillar only going on the milkweed plants. And I want you to observe something here about this caterpillar. You can tell if caterpillars are eating the leaves of your plant because caterpillars will eat from the edge inward. If you see holes in your plants, it's probably because there's beetles eating the leaves. But here's a table of some of the plants that are more common butterflies use as host plants. The painted lady, actually, I suppose the only two plants there that most of us garden with are hollyhocks and lupine. My very favorite butterfly is called the red admiral, and its caterpillars eat nettle, stinging nettle, not the non-stinging nettle, but stinging nettle. So they kind of help with that one. But again, there are plenty of books and resources that have this, and places you can go online and get this information. But I want you to remember that if you want to attract butterflies, you need to really supply food plants for caterpillars and nectar plants for the adults. I like to tell people that I think of flowers as kind of being a punch bowl at happy hour for the butterflies, but the food plants are the salad bar for the caterpillars. And of course, here's a common milkweed, and whenever it shows up in my garden, I take great care that it remains undisturbed. I'm happy to say that I know in many of our suburbs, there are gardening groups that are encouraging people to plant milkweed. This is the common milkweed. I also have something called swamp milkweed, which is probably a little more refined in some people's minds, it has a redder flower. And then there's something called butterfly weed or fireweed, which the wild variety has orange flowers. I understand it's hard to establish, but once it's established, it does extremely well in the garden and is probably one of the most popular flowers to attract butterflies. And again, if you're attracting butterflies and they're laying their eggs and the eggs are hatching into caterpillars, birds are coming to eat the caterpillars. In fact, out of every 100 butterfly eggs laid, probably only one butterfly survives to become an adult. And of course, the good thing about planting these flowers is that there's other pollinators that are having a hard time that you're helping out. Things like honeybees and bumblebees all benefit from your planting native flowers. Now, I just found out a few weeks ago a really, really good resource that I would recommend everyone keep in mind. The National Audubon Society has a place on its website. If you go to audubon.org/plants, they'll take you to the website. And what you simply, after they ask you if you want to join or donate money and you clear that screen, you get to put in your zip code. You put in the Woodridge zip code, and it will come up with a list of 100, 120 trees, shrubs, flowers that it recommends for your area. So I think that's a wonderful site. And I was happy that, I had some of the plants on it in my garden, not all of them. In fact, not even a small minority of them, but I had a few, and I'm working this summer to replace as many or plant as many of the kinds I should have or recommended as I can. Well, I'm getting to the end here. So there are some things I'd like you to remember. First of all, loss of habitat threatens biodiversity and environmental stability. Now you can play a good role, an important role to counter these losses and help birds by providing food, water, and shelter. You can attract hummingbirds by providing feeders and planting specific kinds of flowers. Curate your flowers carefully. The same thing applies to butterflies, but remember to plant flowers for the adults and host plants for the caterpillars. I grow tomatoes, and it hasn't happened yet, but I'm the only one in my family, incidentally, that eats raw tomatoes. But I grow tomatoes in hopes that I'm going to see hornworms, the caterpillars of stink moths, on the tomato plants. Hasn't happened yet, which is, kind of telling, I think, because in some parts of the country, sphinx moths are considered important pests of tomatoes, and I can't attract them when I put plants out for them. And that leads to the fifth point that I think was really important tonight. All plants are not created equal. You want to use native plants as much as possible. Non-native plants are not host plants, and many are invasive, and some, in fact, are even deadly to wildlife. So I invite you to visit the DuPage Birding Club at dupagebirding.org. We're also on Facebook. Both those places have a variety of resources that are available to you. In fact, if you go to the DuPage Birding Club's website and you click at the bottom where it says additional resources, there's a PDF of a leaflet I wrote a few years ago that sort of summarizes everything I've said tonight. Also, I have a Facebook page called John's Natural DuPage. Basically it's my kind of photographic journal of things I've read and seen that interest me. You might enjoy that. I cover a lot of things about nature. Every once in a while, someone corrects something I say, and that's fine with me. And here's a female American goldfinch. Always like to see them. I think they're attractive little birds. I know the male goldfinches do. And last month, 6 weeks, I've had several pairs visiting my yard. And I'm just going to close by saying I hope to see you in the field. If you see a short, fat, old guy with glasses, that's maybe me. I intend to lose the mustache and goatee in a few weeks, but otherwise, I'm pretty much always going to have the camera on my neck. So I have finished this presentation. Where's my stop share? There we go. Okay. So George, do people have some questions? I could probably answer one or two if people do have questions. It's got a little bit of time, I guess.
Yeah, let's see. If anyone has any questions, type your questions into the Q&A chat.
I see Karen has asked the question, what kind of binoculars do you recommend? Karen, good question, good day for that question. I'm going to talk about that for a minute. Actually, the DuPage Birding Club's, one of its former presidents on YouTube has a whole program where he talks about binoculars. Let me just pull some out. I have some right here. When I retired, Karen, I treated myself. And I got this pair. These are Swarovskis. These aren't cheap. They're very, very good. I think these are, 842. 8 is the magnification. 42 is the size of this lens. It's called the objective lens. 42 is the size of the lens in millimeters. And that's important because that determines your field of view and also determines the brightness of your image. These are very, very good. The only reason I got them is that they were on sale. And like I said, I've been wanting to buy a pair for years and I kept putting it off. But when I go out into the field these days, as often as not, I'm photographing. Now, the binoculars I just showed you have a harness, but I have the binoculars here and I have a camera hanging around my neck, and it's heavy and it's tiring. So just this week, I bought myself a new pair of binoculars. These are Nikon travel light binoculars. They cost considerably less than the Swarovskis. They cost, I'll be honest, they cost less than $100, $96 and change. These are 825, so they magnify the same as the Swarovskis, but this is only 25 millimeters. So the field of view is smaller, and the brightness of the image will tend to be a little darker. But these weigh less than half a pound. So these are like nothing. These are like nothing. I also have a pair of Nikon binoculars. Again, 842s, I believe the Monarch series. Very good. I got them at Bass Pro Shop over in Bolingbrook. I think I paid $250 for them. When I was looking for these binoculars, going on Amazon, suddenly a bunch of ads came up for bird watching binoculars, 10 powers, 12 powers. I have a pair of 10 power binoculars I keep in Florida, where I go bird watching along the beaches. 10 power, let me tell you what happens with 10 power. First of all, they're heavier. Secondly, they not only magnify the bird, they magnify everything else. So, you're holding them up and you're shaking a little bit. Well, that shake is going to be magnified too. I would recommend, if you haven't bought a pair of binoculars yet, you don't need to go to Swarovskis. Nikons are fine. I'm trying to think of this. Oh, there's a lot of good. Bushnell 735, 7 power, 35 millimeter lens for years was the standard in bird watching. I have a pair that's semi-retired, but they work very well. 842 would work well. Like I said, I think I'm really going to enjoy these. In fact, I was telling George I'm going out tomorrow to one of my favorite places in Kane County for a couple of hours in the afternoon. And although I'm pretty much more interested in watching, just photographing whatever I see, as much as watching birds, I'm going to take these along and give them their first real field test. I do have, let me show you one more pair I have here. I keep these by one of the windows to watch the bird feeders. These are Bushnell, that's a good brand, 4 by 30. So that's magnification is only 4 times 30 inch or 30 millimeter objective lens. You can kind of get a brightness index. If you take the magnification, in this case 4, and divide it into 30, that goes somewhere between 7 and 8. You take that you take that 7 and you square it, it's 49. That gives you a brightness index of 49. This new pair has a brightness index of 9, and I believe the Swarovskis probably have a brightness index of 25. So that may or may not make a difference to you, but certainly go and try them out. Like I said, if you go to the DuPage Birding Club, if you go to YouTube, you put in DuPage Birding Club, there's a number of videos there. And I think you'll see Dennis Kalina's the man's name, and he did a whole 10-minute presentation on how to use binoculars. I'm not going to get into that right now, but that's a good thing. Is it too late in the season to plant? I'm sitting in what passes for my study, and I'm going to be planting, what am I planting over there? I have morning glories. They're good for butterflies and hummingbirds. Asters, I've never planted those before. They've just germinated. And foxglove, which I'll be very cautious about, because foxglove, although it's attractive to butterflies, apparently everything about the plant's poisonous if you consume it. Cormorants, Laura wants to know. I don't know if anything's going on. Earlier this week, I was at Lambert Lake, which is a small lake here in Glen Ellyn, and there were 7 on the lake. Cormorants, a few years ago, almost went extinct, or were in trouble because I'm trying to think of the chemical that was in the water, but it was causing all kinds of disfigurations and so on. But cormorants, you know, they're a pretty common bird in our area. If you go along some of the highways, I know going south, well, for me, I'm going south on 355 towards I-80, you'll see marshes on either side of the road, and there's a lot of cormorants in there. There's a lot of cormorants along some of the marshes and retention ponds along I-90. So yeah, I had a bird. Oh, you went with Dennis. You met Dennis. Yeah, Dennis is quite the expert here. How can I attract Orioles? Well, I'll tell you what the books say and what I do, and then I'll tell you what kind of success. Orioles like to nest high up in trees. Cottonwoods are a special favorite, and they like to be in the proximity of water. So this Lambert Lake I talked about, there's at least 2 or 3 pairs. I suspect more nesting around the lake. And so that's what you do, you know, the kind of nest site they prefer. A lot of people buy Oriole feeders. Orioles, for some reason, are attracted to oranges. So these Oriole feeders, some of them are bright orange. You take an orange, you cut it in half, and you put it on the Oriole feeder. Others have orange bowls, and they put grape jelly in it. Orioles like grape jelly. So those are 2 foods that have worked. I got to be honest with you. I do that, and I have yet to see an Oriole at my feeders. I've seen over the years, I've seen 1 or 2 during migration, but I've never seen any at my feeder. Some people have a great deal of success with that. I haven't. So I appreciate Karen and your kind comments here. I think I've made some materials available to Dennis. There's a PowerPoint, PDF version of my presentation that you might be able to get through Dennis. And you know, again, I appreciate it. I always like talking to this group. Dennis and I have been planning some activities, let's call it that, possible activities for late summer, early fall. It kind of depends on whether or not I'm in the area. But I always enjoy talking to people in Woodridge. And I actually found out the other day there's a new forest preserve just off Lamont Road. I think it's called Woodridge Forest Preserve. It is undeveloped. There's no parking. There's no trails, but it's on the west. It's located, it looks a few blocks west of Lamont Road, almost before you cross the Des Plaines River. So I'm going to try to make some time this summer to go out someday and check that place out. But it's close to your all neck of the woods. But otherwise, you've got some great birding spots there in Woodridge, and you know, Green Valley, one direction, Waterfall Glen in the other, and a lot of things to the north and south too. So, George, thank you for having me. If there's anything you want to add, I'd be happy to.
Oh, no, that was excellent. As always, John, thank you very much. And as John was saying, we're depending on how things go with the pandemic and us transitioning to having physical programs here through the library again in the fall. We're hoping to set up a bird walk, or maybe even a couple of bird walks in one of our local forest preserves here in Woodridge, through the library. And of course, John would lead those, but that is going to depend on when we start our physical programs again. So just look to the library's website, or read through the library's newsletter when you get it in your mailboxes.
And I would encourage people to, remember the library has excellent books. That's what I learned. I mean, there were no adults in my life who would watch birds, and it was quite a thing for me to find people who shared my interest when I was in my early 20s. So, oh, Jason, met you this spring near Marco Island. Okay, you got me watching birds. Well, I remember you, Jason. Yeah, we were trying to think. I think we saw avocets, and there was that reddish egret. That was cool. That was a good day there. And incidentally, that trail, I like it. I recommended it to the DuPage Birding Club because it's never written about in all the books telling you where to bird when you go to Florida. But I like it because I see more birds than when I spend the $15 or whatever to gain entry into some of those preserves. So, and that's a free trail. And of course, we got to see the alligators if you walk further down the trail, right? Maybe one of these days, I can put together a program about some of the birding I've done in Florida. It's I've had some good times, but quite honestly, it's hard to beat DuPage County for a lot of things. So I always like it when I'm back here watching birds and the flowers and all the other things. So, okay.
Well, thank you very much, John. Excellent.
Good night, everyone.
As
Hope to
always,
talk to you
take
all.
care. Good night.
Night.